Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Sometimes our greatest shame becomes the doorway to our greatest blessing. In the frontier town of Cold Mercy, Preacher Mercer hands his pregnant daughter over to a giant rancher named Cade Rawlins. Everyone thinks it's punishment. Everyone thinks she'll suffer. But Cade does something nobody expects. He treats her with kindness. He gives her safety. He sees her worth when nobody else will. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only person who truly loves her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cold Mercy's dusty main street, but there was nothing warm about the light that filtered through the grimy windows of the general store. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her thin lips together as she watched Lila Jane Mercer walk past, her condition now impossible to hide beneath the loose-fitting dress that had once belonged to her mother. "Shameful," she whispered to her husband, loud enough for half the store to hear. That poor preacher, having to bear such disgrace from his own flesh and blood. Lila kept her chin up as she passed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. At 19, she had learned to navigate the cruel currents of small-town judgment, but these past months had tested even her strongest reserves. The weight in her belly had grown heavier with each passing week, and with it, the weight of her father's disappointment. Cold Mercy, Montana Territory, had earned its name honestly. Carved from unforgiving wilderness in 1867, the town clung to survival through sheer stubbornness and the kind of moral rigidity that could freeze a man's soul even in summer. The main street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen better days before most folks could remember. At one end stood the Methodist Church, its white steeple rising like an accusing finger toward heaven. At the other, the saloon squatted like a toad, drawing the kind of men the good ladies of Cold Mercy pretended not to notice. Between these two poles of salvation and sin, the townspeople lived their careful lives, always mindful of who was watching and what they might say. In a place where winter could kill you, and neighbors were your only lifeline, reputation mattered more than money. A good name could get you credit at the store, help when your roof leaked, or a place by the fire when the wolves came calling. A bad name could leave you dead in a ditch with nobody to mourn your passing. Lila had grown up understanding this delicate balance, raised in the shadow of her father's pulpit, where every word mattered and every action carried the weight of divine judgment. Reverend Isaiah Mercer had built his reputation on moral certitude and righteous fire, delivering sermons that could make grown men weep for their sins and wives examine their own hearts for hidden transgressions. He was a tall man, with silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could thunder against the lectern or comfort the grieving with equal conviction. But those same hands had trembled when Dr. Morrison confirmed what Lila herself had known for weeks. Those same hands had clenched into fists when she refused to name the father, protecting a man who had already fled town without so much as a farewell note. "You have brought shame upon this house," he had said that terrible evening 3 months ago, his voice hollow as a tomb. "Shame upon my ministry, shame upon your mother's memory." The mention of her mother had cut deepest of all. Sarah Beth Mercer had died when Lila was 12, carried off by consumption that no amount of prayer or medicine could touch. She had been the gentle heart of their home, the one who balanced Isaiah's righteousness with tenderness, who read stories by lamplight and pressed wildflowers between the pages of her worn leather Bible. That Bible now sat on Lila's nightstand, its pages yellow with age and marked with her mother's careful notations in the margins. Lila could still remember her mother's voice, soft as summer rain. "Love is patient, my darling. Love is kind. It keeps no record of wrongs." But her father seemed to have forgotten those words, along with so many others that spoke of forgiveness and redemption. The pregnancy had not been born of love, though Lila had thought it might be at the time. Thomas Whitmore had been everything a young woman might dream of in a frontier town, handsome, charming, full of promises about the life they would build together. He had courted her properly for 6 months, attending church services and asking her father's permission to walk her home on Sunday evenings. He spoke of marriage, of a small ceremony in the spring, of children who would grow up knowing both their parents' love. But when autumn came, and her monthly courses did not, Thomas had proven to be made of lesser stuff than his fine words suggested. The very night she told him about the child, he packed his belongings and caught the next stage out of town, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in Denver. That had been 7 months ago, and Denver might as well have been the moon for all the chance she had of finding him. Now, as winter loosened its grip on the mountain valleys and spring struggled to assert itself, Lila faced a future as uncertain as the weather. Her father's congregation whispered behind their hands about the preacher's fallen daughter. The ladies of the church auxiliary had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles. Even her oldest friend, Mary Catherine, now crossed the street rather than speak to her in public. The isolation might have broken a weaker spirit, but Lila had inherited more than her mother's Bible. She had her father's backbone, even if she lacked his capacity for cold judgment. She had learned to find comfort in small things, the way morning light fell across her bedroom floor, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden, the movement of life within her womb that reminded her she was not entirely alone. Still, the loneliness cut deep, especially in the long hours after dark, when her father locked himself in his study to prepare sermons about sin and redemption that seemed directed more at his congregation than at his own heart. He had grown distant since her condition became known, speaking to her only when necessary, and then with the formal politeness he might show a stranger seeking charity. The house that had once rung with laughter and heated discussions about scripture now felt like a tomb. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against china. Evening prayers had dwindled to perfunctory mutterings that carried no warmth, no hope, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting across from him had once been the apple of his eye. It was in this atmosphere of cold disappointment that Lila first heard the name Cade Rawlins spoken in connection with her future. She had been returning from the mercantile, her arms full of supplies for the evening meal, when she caught fragments of conversation drifting from her father's study. "Practical solution to your problem, Reverend," came a voice she recognized as belonging to Mayor Hutchins. "Man like that, he's used to taking care of strays." "I will not have my daughter treated as livestock," her father replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Now, Isaiah, you know Cade's got a good reputation for treating his animals fair. Never heard tell of him being cruel to anything under his care. And Lord knows the man could use some company out there on that spread of his." Lila pressed herself against the hallway wall. Packages clutched to her chest, straining to hear more. Cade Rawlins was a name everyone in Cold Mercy knew, though few could claim to know the man himself. He owned a substantial ranch 15 miles north of town, running cattle and horses on land that stretched from the valley floor to the tree line. Folks said he was a veteran of the war between the states, that he had seen things that left him preferring the company of animals to people. He came to town perhaps once a month for supplies, a giant of a man who moved with surprising quiet for his size. Children stared at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men stepped aside when he walked past. Not from fear, exactly, but from the kind of respect reserved for forces of nature, thunderstorms, avalanches, and men who carried their grief like boulders on their shoulders. "He's a good Christian man," Mayor Hutchins continued, "pays his bills, keeps to himself, never caused trouble for anyone, and he's got that big house sitting empty except for himself." "What you're suggesting is barbaric," her father said, but again there was that telltale hesitation that spoke of a man grasping for solutions to an impossible problem. "What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs somewhere to go, and you need your reputation intact. Cade needs, well, Lord knows what Cade needs, but he's got the space and the means to provide for her. Might work out better than you think." Lila had heard enough. She crept back to the kitchen and set about preparing dinner with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The conversation continued in the study for another hour, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of negotiation. By the time her father called her to set the table, she could see in his eyes that some decision had been reached. But it would be 3 more days before he found the courage to tell her what that decision was. 3 days during which the weight of unspoken words hung over their house like smoke from a distant fire. 3 days during which Lila watched her father wrestle with his conscience and saw that conscience lose the battle, piece by piece, to his pride and his fear of what the town might say if he kept her under his roof much longer. When he finally spoke the words that would change her life forever, they would come not as a father's love seeking the best for his child, but as a preacher's judgment seeking the preservation of his own salvation. And Lila would learn that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the language of necessity, delivered by those who claim to love us most. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning, when the March wind carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Lila was hanging laundry behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate, as her pregnancy had grown more pronounced with each passing week. The sheets snapped like flags of surrender in the gusting air, and she paused to press a hand to her lower back, where a persistent ache had settled. Lila Jane. Her father's voice cut through the morning stillness with the same authority he used to call his congregation to repentance. Come inside. We need to talk. She knew from his tone that the time for avoiding difficult conversations had passed. The way he stood in the doorway, his shoulders set and his mouth drawn into a hard line, told her that whatever decision had been brewing in his study these past days was about to be delivered, like a final judgment. Inside the parlor, 2 men waited beside her father. Mayor Hutchins sat in the good chair, his hat balanced on his knees, and his face wearing the careful neutrality of a man conducting unpleasant business. The other man she recognized, but had never formally met Cade Rawlins himself, standing near the window, with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass. He was even larger than she remembered from her glimpses of him in town, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched the seams of his worn work shirt. His hair was dark brown, touched with grey at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his hands that drew her attention, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, yet somehow gentle in the way he held his hat, as if he understood that even inanimate objects deserved careful treatment. "Sit down, daughter." Her father's voice had taken on the formal cadence he used for serious church business. "Mr. Rawlins and I have reached an understanding about your situation." Lila lowered herself into the chair across from Mayor Hutchins, her heart beginning to race as the full implications of what was happening became clear. "My situation? Your condition has become a source of considerable difficulty for this household," her father continued, pacing behind his chair like a prosecutor before a jury. "As a man of God, I have a responsibility to my congregation, to this community, and to the reputation of the church itself. Your presence here, in your current state, undermines my ability to minister effectively to those who look to me for moral guidance." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the veneer of righteousness. "Father, I have prayed about this extensively," he cut her off, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing power from the familiar rhythms of moral certitude. "And I believe the Lord has provided a solution that serves everyone's best interests. Mr. Rawlins has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you until such time as your situation resolves itself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Lila stared at her father, waiting for him to explain that this was some elaborate joke, that the man who had raised her and taught her about God's love would never actually sell his own daughter like a piece of unwanted furniture. But his eyes held no warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that the woman sitting before him had ever been anything more than an inconvenient burden to be disposed of. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father replied with the finality of scripture, Mr. Rawlins has agreed to provide for your needs until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made for its care and your future." Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Lila, this is really for the best. Mr. Rawlins has a fine spread up north, plenty of room, and he's a God-fearing man who'll see you're treated proper." For the first time since entering the room, Cade Rawlins spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Begging your pardon, Mayor, but I think the lady should hear this from me direct." He turned from the window to face her, and Lila was startled by the kindness she saw in his dark eyes. They were the color of rich earth after rain, and they held none of the judgment or calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces around town. "Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was gentle despite its depth, "I want you to know that this arrangement, if you agree to it, will be conducted with all the respect and propriety you deserve. You'll have your own room in the main house, your own space to do as you please. I won't ask anything of you, except to let me provide for your needs until you decide what you want to do next." "And if I refuse?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the set of her father's jaw. "Then you're welcome to seek shelter wherever you can find it," her father said coldly. "But you will not do so under my roof or with my name to protect you." The cruelty of it took her breath away. In that moment, she saw her father clearly, for perhaps the first Timano as the righteous man of God she had always believed him to be, but as a weak man whose pride mattered more than his daughter's welfare, whose reputation meant more than the child he had raised and claimed to love. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are papers to be signed, of course, legal documents transferring responsibility and such. Nothing permanent, you understand, just until the situation stabilizes." "Papers," Lila repeated numbly. The words seemed to echo in the small room, reducing her entire existence to lines of ink on parchment. "It's all perfectly legal and proper," Mayor Hutchins assured her, producing a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Mr. Rawlins assumes responsibility for your care and maintenance, and in return receives certain considerations regarding your welfare and that of the child." Cade Rawlins stepped forward, his expression darkening. "Now hold on there, Mayor. We never discussed any considerations about the child. That's not what I agreed to." "Well, naturally, if you're providing for the mother, there are certain expectations." "The only expectation," Cade interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both other men pause, "is that I provide a safe place for this young lady to have her baby in peace. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked directly at Lila then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had not seen in months: genuine concern for her well-being, rather than worry about what her presence might cost him. "Miss Mercer," he said carefully, "if you're willing to come stay at my place, I promise you'll be treated with respect. You'll have privacy, comfort, and safety for as long as you need it. And when you're ready to decide what comes next, that'll be your choice to make, not mine or anyone else's." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for her response. Lila looked around at the faces surrounding her father's cold determination, Mayor Hutchins' bureaucratic discomfort, and Cade Rawlins' unexpected compassion. The choice, such as it was, seemed absurdly simple. She could stay and continue to endure her father's contempt and the town's whispered condemnation, growing heavier and more isolated with each passing day until the birth itself became just another source of shame to be hidden away. Or she could take a chance on the kindness she saw in a stranger's eyes, trusting that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. "I'll need to pack my things," she said quietly. Her father nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of business concluded and burdens lifted. "Mr. Rawlins will return for you tomorrow morning. Be ready." As the men filed out of the parlor to complete their arrangements, Lila remained in her chair, one hand resting on her belly, where her child stirred restlessly, as if sensing the monumental change that was coming. Through the window, she could see Cade Rawlins speaking quietly with her father near the front gate, and she caught fragments of his words carried on the wind. "I'll build her a room with windows," he was saying, and something in his tone suggested this was both a promise and a warning. She'll want to see the sky. For the first time in months, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. The journey to Cade Rawlins' ranch took most of the morning, winding through mountain passes where snow still clung to the shadows and early wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Lila sat beside him on the wagon seat, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had changed in the space of 24 hours. Cade drove with the easy competence of a man comfortable with horses and distance, speaking little but pointing out landmarks along the way. A creek where elk came to drink, a stand of aspen trees that turned gold in autumn, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke was gentle, free of the judgment she had grown accustomed to hearing in town. "That's my north pasture," he said as they crested a hill, and the ranch spread out below them. "Cattle winter there mostly, though I move them up higher come summer." Lila gazed down at the valley with something approaching wonder. The ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the light like welcoming eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property: barn, corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop, all connected by well-worn paths and rail fences that spoke of careful maintenance and pride in the work. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. Cade glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected criticism rather than appreciation. "Gets lonely sometimes, but it's good land. Been in my family since before the war." As they drew closer to the house, Lila could see more details that spoke to the character of the man beside her. The porch railings were carved with intricate patterns that suggested long winter evenings spent with careful hands and sharp tools. Flower boxes beneath the windows held the stubble of last year's plantings, waiting for someone to coax new life from their soil. A vegetable garden plot had been prepared for spring planting, the soil dark and rich and ready. "I've got the room ready for you," Cade said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and brief in their contact. "It's got windows facing east and south, so you'll get good light most of the day." The interior of the house was as carefully maintained as the exterior, with wide plank floors polished smooth by years of use and furniture that spoke of quality rather than showiness. Quilts hung over chairbacks, and the stone fireplace showed signs of regular use. Books lined shelves built into the walls, and Lila caught titles that suggested a man of broader interests than his quiet demeanor might indicate. "Kitchen's through there," Cade said, setting her bags down near the staircase. "You're welcome to anything you need. I usually eat simple meat, bread, whatever vegetables I can manage from the garden, but if you know how to cook different, I'd be grateful for the change." He led her upstairs to a room that took her breath away. It was larger than her bedroom at home, with windows on two walls that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. A quilt covered the bed, and someone, Cade, she realized, had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser, their yellow petals bright against the dark wood. But it was the piece of furniture in the corner that made her eyes fill with unexpected tears. A wooden cradle sat there, clearly handmade, with sides carved in the same intricate patterns she had noticed on the porch railings. The wood was smooth as silk, sanded and oiled until it gleamed, and lined with soft fabric that looked suspiciously like it had been cut from one of the quilts downstairs. "You made this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. "Figured you might need it come time. It's nothing fancy, but it's solid. Should last." Lila reached out to touch the smooth wood, overwhelmed by this evidence of thoughtfulness from a man who barely knew her. In town, people crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her condition. Her own father spoke of her pregnancy as a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be welcomed. But this stranger had spent hours crafting something beautiful for a child he would never claim, simply because he saw a need and chose to fill it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. "I'll leave you to get settled," Cade said, backing toward the door with the awkward haste of a man unaccustomed to emotional displays. "Supper's usually around 6, but don't feel obliged. You can eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." After he left, Lila sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was somehow already more welcoming than the house where she had spent 19 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, warming her face and highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had grown so familiar. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. That evening, she ventured downstairs to find Cade in the kitchen, wrestling with what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and the counter, and the expression on his face suggested that cooking was not among his natural talents. "Might I help?" she offered, and at his grateful nod, she took over the preparation while he set the table with the careful precision of a man determined to do things properly. They ate by lamplight, speaking little but comfortably, like old friends who didn't need words to fill every silence. Cade asked about her preferences for breakfast, whether she liked her coffee strong or weak, if there were foods that disagreed with her condition. Simple questions, practical concerns, but underneath them lay a consideration for her welfare that warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. "Thank you," she said as they finished the meal, "for all of this, for the room, the cradle, for treating me like a person deserving of respect." Cade finished quietly. "That's not something you should have to thank anyone for, Miss Mercer. That's just how things ought to be." That night, Lila lay in her new bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling around hearth, creak of wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the mountain sky like scattered diamonds, and for the first time since learning about her pregnancy, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something more than shame and sorrow. In the room below, she could hear Cade moving around the kitchen, banking the fire, and securing the house for the night. The sounds were comforting rather than intrusive, the careful actions of a man taking responsibility for those under his protection. When all was quiet, she placed her hand on her belly, where her child rested, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for whatever providence had led her to this place, to this man who saw her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. Spring arrived at the ranch with gentle insistence, coaxing green shoots from the dark earth and filling the air with the promise of renewal. Lila had been there 2 weeks, and each day brought small revelations about the man who had taken her in and the life they were cautiously building together. She had discovered that Cade rose before dawn, moving through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, always careful not to wake her as he prepared for the day's work. By the time she made her way downstairs, coffee would be waiting on the stove and eggs gathering in a basket by the back door, evidence of his morning rounds through the chicken coop. "You don't have to cook for me," he had said that first week, but she could see the pleasure in his eyes when she insisted on taking over the kitchen duties. It gave her purpose, a way to contribute to the household that didn't involve charity or pity. This morning, like the others, she found him in the vegetable garden plot behind the house, turning soil that had been waiting all winter for attention. His shirt was already damp with perspiration despite the cool air, and dirt clung to his hands and forearms as he worked the stubborn earth into neat rows. "What will you plant?" she asked, settling carefully on the porch steps where she could watch him work. "The usual: potatoes, beans, carrots, onions, whatever keeps well through winter." He paused in his digging to look at her. "You have thoughts on the matter?" The question surprised her. Thomas had never asked her opinion about anything more substantial than what dress to wear to church. Her father made pronouncements rather than seeking input, but Cade seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "My mother used to grow herbs," she said, remembering Sarah Beth's small garden behind the parsonage. "Sage and thyme, parsley and dill. She said they made even simple food taste like celebration." "Herbs would be good," Cade agreed, resuming his work. Haven't had much call for them, cooking just for myself, but I reckon that's about to change. Later that morning, Lila found a packet of wildflower seeds in the supply closet, clearly forgotten from some previous spring's ambitious plans. Without asking permission, she claimed a corner of the garden plot and scattered the seeds with the same faith her mother had shown in her herb garden trust, that something beautiful could grow from the simplest beginnings. As the days lengthened and warmed, she found herself venturing farther from the house, exploring the ranch with the careful steps of someone learning to trust her feet again. Cade had introduced her to the animals with the formal courtesy he might use for distinguished guests. There was Duchess, an ancient milk cow with wise eyes and a gentle disposition. The horses, Thunder, Belle, and Smoku, came to the fence when she approached, curious about this new presence in their domain. "They're good judges of character," Cade had said, watching Belle nuzzle Lila's palm in search of treats. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss about themselves." The chickens proved to be the most entertaining, a collection of hens with distinct personalities, and a rooster named Napoleon, who took his responsibilities seriously. Lila discovered that gathering eggs could be either a peaceful meditation or a military operation, depending on Napoleon's mood and whether he deemed her worthy of access to his ladies. "He's protective," Cade explained after Napoleon had chased her from the coop in a flurry of indignant squawking. "Can't fault him for that." In the evenings, after the animals were tended and the day's work complete, they fell into a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet conversation. Cade proved to be a better listener than talker, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to speak about things she had kept locked away for months. "You miss teaching," he observed one evening, as she described her work at the small school in Cold Mercy, before her condition made it impossible to continue. "I miss the children," she said, surprised by how much the admission hurt. "They didn't care about my circumstances. They just wanted to learn their letters and hear stories." "You could teach again," Cade said carefully. "When you're ready. There are always children who need learning, and not all of them are lucky enough to live in towns with proper schools." The possibility had never occurred to her. In her father's house, her pregnancy had felt like an ending, the conclusion of all her dreams and aspirations. But here, watching the sun set over the valley while her child stirred restlessly in her womb, she could almost imagine a different kind of future. "Tell me about the war," she said one evening, recognizing in his eyes the same shadows she had seen in other veterans who had passed through Cold Mercy. Cade was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. "Lost a lot of good men," he said simply. "Came home to find I'd lost my wife too. Consumption took her while I was gone, and nobody thought to write and tell me until it was too late for goodbyes." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stared into the fire for a moment before continuing. "Used to think this place was too quiet, too empty. But quiet's not so bad when it's the right kind of quiet. When it's peaceful instead of just hollow." She understood what he meant. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than judgment. It was the kind of quiet that came from shared understanding, from two people who had both learned that life could disappoint you in ways you never expected, but still surprise you with unexpected grace. "Cade," she said, using his name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Why did you agree to take me in? Really?" He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious and honest. "Because nobody deserves to be thrown away like rubbish, especially not when they're carrying life. And because this place needed someone who could see its beauty instead of just its loneliness." That night, as she watched her wildflower seeds beginning to sprout in neat green rows, Lila realized that something was growing inside her too, not just the child she carried, but hope itself, taking root in soil that had seemed barren just weeks before. For the first time since leaving her father's house, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The discovery came by accident on a warm May morning when Lila was helping Cade organize his cluttered desk in search of receipts for the tax assessor. She had been staying at the ranch for 6 weeks, and their easy partnership had extended to household tasks that he had clearly been neglecting for years. "You keep your important papers in the oddest places," she said, pulling a deed from between the pages of a veterinary manual. "How do you ever find anything?" "I mostly don't," Cade admitted, sorting through a stack of correspondence that dated back several years. "Never was much good at the business side of ranching. I just know how to work the land and care for the animals." It was while reaching for a ledger on the highest shelf that her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box pushed far back behind the books. When she brought it down, Cade's entire body went still, his face draining of color as he recognized what she held. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, seeing his distress. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, though his voice had gone hoarse. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was made of the same fine wood as her cradle, polished smooth by handling and age. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay a military medallion bronze star, she realized, recognizing it from illustrations she had seen in newspapers during the war. Beneath it was a small daguerreotype of a young woman with gentle eyes and a smile that spoke of quiet happiness. "Your wife," Lila said softly, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Mary Elizabeth." Cade's voice was barely above a whisper. She was. She was everything good about this place, everything I was fighting to come home to. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the kind of serene beauty that came from deep contentment rather than mere physical features. This was someone who had been truly loved, truly cherished, and the knowledge of what Cade had lost made her heart ache for him. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said, instinctively understanding that this was at the heart of his grief. She wanted children more than anything, Cade confirmed, taking the photograph with reverent care. "We tried for 3 years before I left for the war. She was so sure that by the time I came home, but the consumption took that dream along with everything else." "Tell me about her," Lila said, settling into the chair across from him. "What was she like?" For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then something in his expression softened, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask that question. "She laughed at everything," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Used to say that life was too hard to waste time being grim about it. She could find joy in the smallest things, a butterfly in the garden, a good crop of tomatoes, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table." As he spoke, Lila could see Mary Elizabeth taking shape in her mind, a woman who had filled this house with warmth and laughter, who had made Cade believe in possibilities beyond mere survival. No wonder the place had felt hollow to him after her death. No wonder he had retreated into solitude rather than try to rebuild what they had shared. "She sounds wonderful," Lila said, meaning it completely. "She was, and she would have liked you." Cade looked up from the photograph to meet her eyes. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survived things that would have broken lesser women. She always could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the house, unusual enough to make them both look toward the window with concern. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were virtually unheard of. "Stay here," Cade said, but Lila was already moving toward the window to peer through the curtains. 3 men sat on horseback in the yard, their clothes marking them as townspeople rather than neighboring ranchers. She recognized one of them, Dr. Morrison, who had confirmed her pregnancy what seemed like a lifetime ago. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested official business of some kind. "Dr. Morrison's here," she said, her stomach clenching with sudden anxiety. "With 2 men I don't recognize." Cade cursed under his breath, carefully placing his wife's photograph back in its box. "Probably the territorial health inspector and a deputy marshal. I was wondering when they'd show up." "What do they want?" "To make sure you're being treated properly, I'd guess. Your father's been getting questions from the church hierarchy about his daughter's sudden disappearance. Had to provide some kind of official explanation." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. "They want to take me back." "Not if I have anything to say about it." Cade's voice carried a quiet determination that reminded her of the military bearing she could sometimes glimpse beneath his civilian gentleness. But they'll want to inspect the arrangements, ask questions, make sure everything's legal and proper. The knock on the front door was firm and official. Cade straightened his shoulders and walked to answer it, every inch the respectable rancher welcoming unexpected guests. Lila heard the murmur of voices, formal introductions, the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations. "Miss Mercer," Dr. Morrison said as she entered the parlor, his tone professionally neutral. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Dr. Morrison, I'm feeling very well." The health inspector, a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone who found fault with everything he examined, looked around the room with obvious skepticism. "I am Inspector Hartwell from the Territorial Capital. We've received complaints about the irregular nature of your living arrangements here." "Complaints from whom?" Cade asked, though they all knew the answer. "Concerned citizens who question whether proper moral standards are being maintained," the deputy marshal said. He was younger than the others, with the nervous energy of a man eager to prove his authority. "There are laws about unmarried persons of opposite genders cohabitating, especially when one party is in a delicate condition." "Miss Mercer has her own quarters," Cade said evenly. "She receives proper care and supervision. I fail to see what laws might be violated by Christian charity." "Christian charity is one thing," Inspector Hartwell said, producing a notebook and pencil. "But the appearance of impropriety is quite another. I'll need to examine the living arrangements and speak with Miss Mercer privately to ensure she is here of her own free will." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, inspections, and barely concealed accusations. The men examined her room, questioned her about her daily routine, and asked pointed questions about the nature of her relationship with Cade that made her face burn with embarrassment and anger. Through it all, Cade remained calm and respectful, answering their inquiries with the patience of a man who had nothing to hide. But Lila could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when they implied that he might be taking advantage of her vulnerable situation. "Everything appears to be in order," Dr. Morrison said finally, his tone suggesting that he was not entirely pleased with this conclusion. "Miss Mercer seems to be receiving adequate care." "More than adequate," she said firmly, finding her voice at last. "Mr. Rawlins has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. I am here by choice, and I am grateful for his protection." The words seemed to surprise them, as if they had expected to find a frightened, mistreated woman grateful for rescue. Instead, they found someone who spoke with quiet dignity about her circumstances and clear appreciation for the man who had given her sanctuary. After they left, Lila and Cade sat in the parlor, both drained by the encounter. The medal and photograph still lay on the desk between them, reminders of the conversation that had been interrupted by official scrutiny. "This won't be the end of it," Cade said quietly. "Your father's not going to let this rest. He needs to prove that his decision was righteous, that you're being properly managed." "Then what do we do?" Cade looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shifting in his expression, a decision being made, a line being drawn. "We make sure they have nothing to complain about," he said. "We make this arrangement so respectable, so unquestionably proper, that even your father can't find fault with it." Lila had the distinct feeling that he was talking about something more than just maintaining separate quarters and observing social proprieties. But whatever plan was forming in his mind, she trusted him to handle it with the same careful consideration he had shown her from the very beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June, delivered by a rider who wouldn't meet Lila's eyes as he handed over the envelope. Her name was written across the front in handwriting she recognized with a sinking, heart-bold, confident strokes that had once seemed romantic but now felt like a threat. Thomas Whitmore had found her. Lila sat on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands as she watched the messenger disappear down the valley road. Her child had grown active in recent weeks, responding to her moods with restless movement that reminded her constantly of the life she carried and the choices that lay ahead. "Bad news?" Cade asked, emerging from the barn where he had been shoeing one of the horses. He took one look at her face and set down his tools, his expression darkening with concern. "It's from Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the father of my child." Cade's entire body went still, the way she had seen him react when a storm was approaching, or when something had spooked the cattle. "What does he want?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it yet." She stared at the envelope, as if it might burst into flames at any moment. "I thought he was gone forever. It's been almost 8 months since he left." "Maybe we should read it together," Cade suggested gently, settling beside her on the steps. "Whatever it says, you don't have to face it alone." With shaking fingers, Lila broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting filled a single page, the words as careless and self-serving as the man who had written them. "My dear Lila," she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with anger. "I have recently learned of your situation and current circumstances through mutual acquaintances in Denver. I must say I am disturbed to hear that you have taken up residence with a stranger rather than waiting for my return to properly address our situation." Cade made a sound low in his throat that might have been a growl. "Our situation? The man abandons you and then has the nerve to claim ownership." Lila continued reading, each word stoking the fire of her indignation. "I have concluded my business affairs here and am prepared to return to Cold Mercy to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to conduct yourself with appropriate discretion until I arrive to make the necessary arrangements for our marriage and the proper raising of my child." "His child," Cade repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's more." Lila's hands were shaking again, but with fury rather than fear. "I trust you will see the wisdom of ending your current inappropriate arrangement immediately. A woman in your condition should not be living in sin with a man who has no legal claim to her welfare. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family." The letter was signed with Thomas's full name and a flourish that suggested he considered the matter settled by his mere declaration of intent. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of Thomas's presumption settling between them like a stone. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise now felt charged with the threat of upheaval, of having the careful sanctuary they had built together torn apart by a man who had forfeited any right to claim either Lila or her child. "He thinks he can just waltz back here and pick up where he left off," Lila said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage. "As if the past 8 months never happened. As if I've been sitting here like some faithful dog waiting for him to remember I exist." "What do you want to do?" Cade asked, and the question surprised her with its simplicity. Not what she should do, or what was proper, or what others might expect what she wanted. "I want to burn this letter and pretend I never received it," she said honestly. "I want Thomas Whitmore to disappear, back to wherever he came from, and leave us in peace." "Us," Cade repeated softly, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Cade, She stopped, realizing what she had revealed in her moment of emotional honesty. "I didn't mean to presume." "You weren't presuming anything," he said, his dark eyes serious and intent. "These past months, watching you bloom here, watching you find your strength again, it's been like seeing the ranch come back to life. You belong here, Lila. Not because of some legal arrangement or charitable obligation, but because this place needs you the way the earth needs rain." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch could have been. Lila felt her heart racing, not with fear but with a recognition that had been building for weeks, the understanding that what had begun as rescue had grown into something far deeper and more precious. "But Thomas has legal rights," she said, trying to be practical, even as her heart yearned toward the possibility Cade was offering. "He is the father, and unmarried women have few protections under the law. Legal rights can be challenged," Cade said firmly. "A man who abandons a woman when she needs him most, who leaves her to face shame and hardship alone, that's not a father. That's just a man who happened to plant a seed." The fierce protectiveness in his voice reminded her of Napoleon defending his hens, but there was something more here, a depth of caring that went beyond mere chivalry or duty. "What are you saying, Cade?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where their wildflowers had begun to bloom in brilliant patches of color among the green grass. When he spoke, his words were careful, deliberate, weighted with significance. "I'm saying that if you were my wife, legally and properly, Thomas Whitmore would have no claim on you or your child. I'm saying that what we've built here doesn't have to end just because some fool finally remembered his responsibilities." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Cade said, turning to face her fully. "Not because you need protection, though I'd be honored to provide it. Not because it would solve our immediate problem, though it would. I'm asking because somewhere, in these past months, watching you plant flowers and teach Napoleon proper manners and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you." The words seemed to hang in the morning air like music, beautiful and unexpected and perfect in their simplicity. Lila looked at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who was offering not just his name and protection, but his heart. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling like a prayer. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope." "Hope's not something to be afraid of," Cade said, reaching for her hands with the gentle reverence she had come to associate with all his gestures toward her. "Not when it's grounded in truth." He leaned forward then, slowly and carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, when she instead tilted her face up toward his, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of patience and deep affection rather than mere passion. "We'll need to act quickly," he said when they broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "If Thomas is planning to arrive by month's end, we should be married before then. Make it impossible for him to challenge our legal standing." "The preacher in town won't marry us," Cade finished grimly. "Not with your father's opposition and the questions about your condition, but there's a circuit judge who comes through Copper Falls once a month. Judge Harrison, he's a fair man, more concerned with justice than appearances." As they sat together planning their future, Lila felt the last of her fears dissolving like morning mist. Thomas's letter, which had seemed like such a threat just minutes ago, now felt like nothing more than the desperate bluster of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman, but as Lila Rawlins' wife, partner, and beloved companion to a man who had shown her what true love looked like. The journey to Copper Falls took most of the day, winding through mountain passes that Lila had never seen before. She sat beside Cade on the wagon seat, wearing her mother's best dress navy blue with tiny pearl buttons that she had let out as much as possible to accommodate her condition. In her lap she held a small bouquet of wildflowers from their garden, the same varieties she had planted that first hopeful morning at the ranch. Judge Harrison proved to be a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the practical manner of someone who had spent his career dealing with the realities of frontier life rather than its idealized version. His temporary courthouse was the back room of the Copper Falls Hotel, where he conducted business with the efficient dignity of a man who understood that legal ceremonies should be meaningful rather than merely formal. "Mr. Rawlins, Miss Mercer," he said, looking up from the papers Cade had presented. "I understand you wish to be married today." "Yes, sir," Cade replied, his hand finding Lila's with gentle reassurance. "We have the license and witnesses." The witnesses were the hotel proprietor and his wife, strangers who had agreed to serve in this capacity with the casual kindness that frontier communities showed to those in need of assistance. They stood quietly in the corner, respectful of the solemnity of the moment. "Miss Mercer," Judge Harrison said, his tone gentle but direct, "are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, without coercion or undue influence?" "I am," Lila said firmly, meaning every word. "And you understand that marriage is a legal contract with responsibilities and obligations that cannot be easily dissolved?" "We do," they answered together. The ceremony itself was simple but dignified, the judge's words carrying the weight of law and tradition without unnecessary elaboration. When Cade slipped a simple gold band onto her finger run he had purchased that morning from the general store, Lila felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Isaiah Mercer's disgraced daughter or Thomas Whitmore's abandoned woman. She was Lila Rawlins, wife and partner to a man who loved her. The ride home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had just made a momentous decision and found it good. The late afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, and their ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever as they crested the final hill. But as they drew closer to the house, Lila noticed something that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. 3 horses stood tied to the front porch rail, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the warm weather signs of visitors who had made themselves at home in their absence. "Stay close to me," Cade said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check the rifle secured beneath the wagon seat. They were still 50 yards from the house when the front door opened and 3 men emerged onto the porch. Thomas Whitmore led the group, looking every inch the successful businessman in his fine clothes and polished boots. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, his face wearing the careful neutrality of a politician trying to navigate troubled waters. The third man was a stranger well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Lila," Thomas called out as if greeting a beloved friend rather than the woman he had abandoned 8 months earlier. "Thank God you're safe. When I arrived and found you missing, I feared the worst." Cade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, his body radiating the controlled tension of a man preparing for conflict. "Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you for another week. I was able to conclude my business earlier than anticipated," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on Lila with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I came as soon as I received word about Lila's situation." "Her situation is perfectly respectable," Cade said evenly, helping Lila down from the wagon with careful attention to her condition. "Living in sin with a stranger while carrying my child." Thomas's voice carried the righteous indignation of a man who had convinced himself he was the injured party. "I think not." "Actually," Lila said, finding her voice and her courage, "my situation is that of a properly married woman. Mr. Rawlins and I were wed this afternoon by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls." The silence that followed her announcement was so complete that she could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a rage so pure it made his features ugly. "Impossible," he sputtered. "You can't marry someone else while carrying my child. It's not legal, it's not moral." "It's perfectly legal," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am attorney Charles Brennan from Denver. Mr. Whitmore engaged my services to ensure the proper resolution of this matter. However, if what you say is true, Mrs. Rawlins, is it? Then the situation has become considerably more complex." Cade reached into his jacket and produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh and the judge's seal clearly visible. "Mrs. Rawlins is my wife in every legal sense. Her previous relationship with Mr. Whitmore, whatever its nature, was never formalized through marriage. He has no legal claim on her whatsoever." Attorney Brennan examined the document with the thoroughness of a man trained to find flaws in legal proceedings. After several minutes, he looked up with obvious frustration. "The marriage appears to be entirely valid. Mr. Whitmore, I'm afraid your position has become untenable." "My position?" Thomas's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "That's my child she's carrying, my blood. You can't tell me I have no rights to my own offspring." "Actually, I can," Brennan said with professional detachment. "Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is presumed to be the child of the husband, regardless of the biological circumstances. Mrs. Rawlins' child will be legally considered Mr. Rawlins' child from the moment of birth." The implications of this hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had been so confident in his righteousness, so certain that his mere appearance would resolve everything in his favor, that he hadn't considered the possibility that Lila might have moved beyond waiting for his return. "This is outrageous," he declared, turning to Mayor Hutchins as if expecting support. You can't allow this travesty to stand. The woman was practically given to this man like property. The marriage is clearly a sham, designed to prevent me from claiming what's rightfully mine. Now see here, young man, Mayor Hutchins said uncomfortably, the Rawlins marriage may have been sudden, but it appears to be entirely legal. And given your own absence during the lady's time of need, I'm not sure you're in a position to make demands. Lila watched this exchange with growing amazement. For months, she had lived in fear of this confrontation, imagining Thomas as a figure of overwhelming authority who could sweep back into her life and reclaim control. Instead, she saw him for what he really was, selfish man who had expected the world to remain frozen in place while he pursued his own interests. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had found her strength, "you made your choice 8 months ago when you left me to face this alone. I've made mine today. Mr. Rawlins, me husband, has shown me more kindness and respect in 3 months than you managed in 6 months of courtship. But the child will be raised by parents who love and want it." Lila interrupted firmly, "by a father who carved its cradle with his own hands and a mother who will teach it that real love means staying, even when times are difficult." Thomas looked around the group, seeking any ally in his cause, but found only faces that ranged from hostile to merely unsympathetic. Even Attorney Brennan, despite being paid for his services, seemed to recognize the futility of challenging a legal marriage based on moral outrage alone. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "I'll find a way to challenge this mockery. That child belongs to me." "No," Cade said, speaking for the first time since presenting their marriage certificate. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man defending his family. "That child belongs to the family that wants it, protects it, and will love it every day of its life. You're not part of that family, Whitmore. You never were." As the 3 men prepared to leave, defeated in their mission but unwilling to acknowledge it gracefully, Lila felt a profound sense of completion. The future she had feared for so many months, a future dominated by shame, obligation, and loveless duty, had been replaced by something infinitely better. She was Mrs. Rawlins now, partner to a man who had proven his love through action rather than words, mother to a child who would grow up knowing security and acceptance rather than shame. And as she watched Thomas Whitmore ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight like the bad dream he had always been, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting, but from choosing a different battlefield entirely. The weeks following Thomas's departure brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the very air had been cleansed of the tension that had hung over them since his letter arrived. Lila settled into her new role as Mrs. Rawlins with a contentment that surprised her in its completeness. The gold band on her finger caught the morning light as she gathered eggs, and she found herself pausing to admire it not for its modest beauty, but for what it represented. She was no longer alone. More than that, she was truly wanted. July brought the full heat of summer to the valley, and with it, the constant activity of a working ranch. Lila had grown large with child, her movements careful but determined as she refused to let her condition render her useless. Cade worried constantly about her overexerting herself, but she had discovered that physical activity helped manage the restless energy that came with the final months of pregnancy. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said one morning as he found her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables despite the early hour heat. "Least of all to me." "I'm not trying to prove anything," she replied, straightening with one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm trying to be useful. This baby's going to come whether I sit in a chair all day or keep working. I'd rather be productive." The vegetables they had planted together in the spring had flourished beyond either of their expectations. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their poles with eager abundance, and the herb garden had become a fragrant paradise that made even simple meals taste like celebrations. Lila had discovered that she possessed her mother's gift for coaxing life from the earth, and the evidence of that gift surrounded them in green profusion. But it was the wildflower patch that drew her attention most often. The seeds she had scattered that first hopeful morning had grown into a riot of color-purple lupines, yellow coreopsis, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds in delightful abundance. Looking at them, she could measure the distance she had traveled from the frightened, shamed woman who had arrived at the ranch 4 months ago. The transformation was not lost on the neighbors either. Word of their marriage had spread through the mountain communities with the speed that news always traveled in sparsely populated areas. Some of the responses had been predictably judgmental, whispered, comments about hasty weddings and questionable circumstances. But others had surprised her with their warmth and acceptance. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose ranch lay 10 miles to the west, had arrived one afternoon with a basket of baby clothes and a matter-of-fact manner that brooked no embarrassment. "Every child needs proper clothing," she had said, unpacking tiny gowns and blankets with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "These belong to my youngest, and they're too good to waste." "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just raise that baby with love and teach it right from wrong. That's all any of us can do." The Hendricks family from the next valley had sent their eldest son with an offer to help with the heavier ranch work as Lila's time drew near. Even crusty old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle on the far side of the mountain, had stopped by to offer his congratulations and share a bottle of whiskey with Cade in celebration of the marriage. "Takes a strong woman to make a go of it out here," he had said, nodding approvingly at Lila's obvious contentment. "And takes a wise man to recognize one when he sees her." But along with the acceptance came other, more troubling developments. Dr. Morrison had stopped by twice in recent weeks, ostensibly to check on Lila's condition, but clearly fishing for information about the circumstances of her marriage. His questions had a pointed quality that suggested someone was encouraging his curiosity. "Everything appears normal," he had said after his most recent examination, "though I confess surprise at how settled you seem, given the unusual circumstances of your situation." "What's unusual about a woman being happy in her marriage?" Lila had asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the doctor step back slightly. "Nothing, of course. Nothing at all. I simply meant, that is, the timing of events." "The timing of events is our business, Dr. Morrison," Cade had interjected with quiet firmness. "I trust you'll respect our privacy in that regard." More concerning had been the letter from her father that arrived the day after Dr. Morrison's second visit. It was the first communication she had received from him since leaving Cold Mercy, and its contents were as cold and judgmental as she had expected. "Lila," she read aloud to Cade that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I have been informed of your recent marriage and find myself deeply disturbed by the haste and circumstances of this union. While I cannot prevent what has already been done, I feel compelled to warn you that Mr. Whitmore has not abandoned his claims regarding the child you carry. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud and deception." Cade's jaw tightened as she continued reading. "Furthermore, questions have been raised about the propriety of your living arrangements prior to the wedding ceremony. Several members of my congregation have expressed concern that your marriage may have been contracted solely to avoid the legal consequences of immoral behavior." "The man has quite an imagination," Cade said grimly. "There's more." Lila's voice had grown steadier with anger. "I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that I cannot in good conscience acknowledge this marriage or any children that may result from it. You have made your choice, and you must live with the consequences. Do not expect support or recognition from your family in this matter." She folded the letter carefully, her hands remarkably steady, despite the emotional impact of her father's rejection. "He's disowning me, officially and completely." "Are you surprised?" Lila considered the question seriously before answering. "No. Disappointed, but not surprised. My father was always more concerned with appearances than with people, even when I was a child. I suppose I hoped that becoming a grandmother might soften him, but that was naive." "His loss," Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. Any man who would disown his own daughter for choosing love over shame isn't much of a father to begin with. The words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely ease the sadness that came with having her fears confirmed. She was truly alone in the world now, except for the man beside her and the child growing within her. It was both terrifying and liberating, the knowledge that she had no safety net except what she and Cade built together. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. "Active tonight," Cade observed, his eyes crinkling with the gentle humor she had come to love. "Very active. I think this child is going to be a handful. Takes after its mother, then." The teasing comment was delivered with such obvious affection that Lila felt her melancholy lifting despite the weight of her father's rejection. This was her family now, this quiet, strong man who had shown her what real love looked like, and the child who would complete their small circle. But even as she treasured these peaceful moments, Lila could not shake the feeling that they were living in a brief calm before a storm. Thomas's threats, her father's warnings, the pointed questions from Dr. Morrison, all of these suggested that their carefully constructed new life was still vulnerable to outside interference. The feeling proved prophetic when a rider arrived the next morning with news that made Cade's face go pale with concern. Thomas Whitmore had returned to Cold Mercy, this time accompanied by a territorial judge and a marshal carrying legal documents that challenged the validity of their marriage. "He's claiming fraud," the messenger explained, a young man who clearly relished being the bearer of dramatic news. "Says you coerced Miss Mercer, Mrs. Rawlins, into marrying you to avoid facing charges for harboring a woman in immoral circumstances. Says the whole thing was a sham to cover up improper relations." "That's ridiculous," Lila said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Maybe so, Ma'am, but Judge Carmichael takes these things serious. He's ordered you both to appear in Cold Mercy tomorrow for a formal hearing. Says if you don't show, he'll issue a warrant for your arrest." As the messenger rode away, leaving them to absorb this new crisis, Lila felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. Just when she had found safety and happiness, just when she had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, the past had reached out to drag her back into uncertainty. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the note of fear that had crept into her voice. Cade was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the mountains that ringed their valley like protective walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet determination she had heard the day he first brought her to the ranch. "We go to Cold Mercy," he said simply. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The words were brave, but as Lila looked toward the town that had been so eager to cast her out, she wondered if the truth would be enough to protect the life they had built together. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could truly triumph over the forces of shame and judgment that had ruled her life for so long. The courthouse in Cold Mercy had never seemed so imposing as it did on that sweltering August morning when Lila and Cade arrived to defend their marriage. The building, which normally served as a meeting hall for town functions, had been transformed into a formal court with Judge Carmichael's bench positioned beneath the large window that faced Main Street. Half the town seemed to have gathered for the proceedings, filling every available seat and lining the walls with the eager anticipation of spectators at a prize fight. Lila walked slowly up the courthouse steps, her hand resting on Cade's steady arm for support. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, but she held her head high as she passed through the crowd of familiar faces. Some watched with open hostility, others with curiosity, but a few like Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family offered encouraging nods that reminded her she was not entirely without allies. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with Attorney Brennan, his expression radiating the confidence of a man certain of victory. He had dressed for the occasion in his finest suit, every inch the successful businessman seeking justice against rural fraudsters. When Lila entered the room, his eyes fixed on her swollen figure with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Judge Carmichael was a stern-faced man in his 50s, appointed by the territorial government and known for his strict interpretation of the law. He called the proceedings to order with the sharp rap of his gavel, and the murmur of conversation died immediately. "This court is convened to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Rawlins," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mr. Whitmore seeks to have the marriage between Mr. Cade Rawlins and the former Miss Lila Mercer declared invalid on grounds of fraud and coercion." Attorney Brennan rose smoothly to present his case, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, was engaged in legitimate business in Denver when he learned that the woman carrying his child had been essentially sold to Mr. Rawlins by her father. Rather than wait for Mr. Whitmore's return to properly address the situation, Mr. Rawlins took advantage of Miss Mercer's vulnerable condition to enter into a fraudulent marriage designed solely to prevent Mr. Whitmore from claiming his parental rights. The words painted Lila as a helpless victim and Cade as a scheming opportunist, reducing their love to a mere legal maneuver. She felt Cade's hand tighten on hers, but his expression remained calm as Brennan continued his attack. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Rawlins and Miss Mercer were living in immoral circumstances for months prior to their hasty wedding ceremony. Dr. Morrison will testify that he observed clear signs of intimate relations between the defendants, making their marriage nothing more than an attempt to legitimize sinful behavior." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this accusation, and Lila felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The lies came so easily to these men, wrapped in legal language that made slander sound like justice. "Mr. Whitmore seeks custody of his unborn child and compensation for the emotional distress caused by the defendant's deceptive actions," Brennan concluded. "We ask this court to declare the marriage void and restore my client's rightful position as father to the child in question." Judge Carmichael nodded gravely and turned to the defense table where Cade and Lila sat with the young lawyer they had managed to engage from a neighboring town. Samuel Crawford was barely out of law school, but he had the passionate idealism of youth and a genuine belief in justice that more experienced attorneys might have lost. "Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense." Crawford stood, his nervous energy evident as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case represents nothing more than the desperate attempt of a man who abandoned his responsibilities to reclaim what he discarded when it became inconvenient. Whitmore left Miss Mercer to face shame and hardship alone. Mr. Rawlins offered her protection, respect, and eventually his name in marriage union entered into freely and with genuine affection." The young lawyer's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his argument. "The marriage certificate is valid, properly executed by Judge Harrison in Copper Falls. Mrs. Rawlins will testify that she entered the union willingly, motivated by love rather than legal convenience. This court should not reward abandonment by punishing the good man who stepped forward when Mr. Whitmore failed in his duties." As Crawford spoke, Lila noticed movement near the back of the courtroom. Her father had entered quietly, his presence commanding immediate attention from those who recognized him. Reverend Isaiah Mercer walked slowly down the center aisle, his face grave as he took a seat in the front row. The sight of him sent a chill through her had he come to support Thomas's claims. To publicly disown her before the entire community? Judge Carmichael called for the first witness, and Dr. Morrison took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Brennan's questioning, he testified about his visits to the ranch, carefully implying impropriety without making direct accusations that could be easily challenged. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Morrison," Brennan asked, "did Mrs. Rawlins appear to be a woman who had entered marriage freely, or one who might have been coerced by circumstances?" Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the courthouse bell began to toll not the regular hourly chime, but the urgent rhythm used to call the community together in times of crisis. The sound seemed to echo through the building like a divine judgment, demanding attention and bearing witness to the truth about to be revealed. Dr. Morrison's testimony faltered as the bell continued its urgent tolling, and Judge Carmichael frowned at the interruption. But before he could call for order, Lila felt a familiar tightening in her belly, different from the usual discomfort, sharper and more insistent. She gripped Cade's hand, her face going pale as understanding dawned. "The baby," she whispered, and the words seemed to carry through the suddenly quiet courtroom. Cade's chair scraped against the wooden floor as he stood immediately, his protective instincts overriding all legal protocols. "Your Honor, my wife needs medical attention." "Now see here," Thomas protested, rising from his seat with obvious irritation. "This is clearly a ploy to avoid." His words were cut short as Lila doubled over with a sharp cry, her hand pressed to her belly as another contraction seized her. The reality of the situation became immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom, and the legal proceedings suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the drama of impending birth. Dr. Morrison abandoned the witness stand without being dismissed, his professional instincts taking precedence over legal formalities. "We need to get her somewhere she can lie down," he said, moving quickly to Lila's side. "This baby's not waiting for your hearing to conclude." "She can't leave," Attorney Brennan insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The court must resolve this matter before." "The court," Judge Carmichael interrupted with surprising firmness, "will not interfere with the birth of a child. This hearing is suspended until further notice." As Cade swept Lila into his arms with gentle strength, preparing to carry her from the courthouse, an unexpected voice rose from the front row. "Wait." Reverend Isaiah Mercer stood slowly, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. "Before you go, there are things that must be said, things this court needs to hear." Thomas turned eagerly toward the preacher, clearly expecting support for his cause. "Reverend Mercer, thank you for coming. I'm sure you'll help this court understand the true nature of—" "Be silent," Isaiah commanded with the authority that had silenced congregations for decades. "You forfeited any right to speak about my daughter when you abandoned her in her hour of need." The courthouse fell into absolute stillness, everyone straining to hear what the preacher would say next. Another contraction gripped Lila, but she managed to remain conscious as her father approached the bench. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection, "I have come here today not to support Mr. Whitmore's claims, but to confess my own sins before this community and before God." He turned to face the packed courtroom, his eyes finding Lila's for the first time in months. "I stand before you as a man who preached love while showing none to his own child, who spoke of forgiveness while harboring judgment in his heart, who valued his reputation more than his daughter's welfare." Thomas started to protest, but Isaiah's raised hand silenced him immediately. "When my daughter needed me most, I cast her out like refuse," the preacher continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "I gave her to Mr. Rawlins not out of concern for her welfare, but to preserve my own standing in this community. I failed as a father and as a Christian." He moved closer to where Cade held Lila, his weathered hands trembling as he reached toward them both. "But Cade Rawlins succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I could see only my own shame. He offered her safety when I offered only judgment. He gave her love when I gave her nothing but cold duty." Another contraction seized Lila, more intense than the last, and Cade shifted her carefully in his arms. "Reverend, we need to—" "One moment more," Isaiah said urgently. "Mr. Whitmore, you speak of rights and claims, but what claim does a man have who flees when faced with responsibility? What right to fatherhood belongs to someone who leaves a woman to bear shame alone?" He turned back to the judge, his voice gaining strength. "Your Honor, I have witnessed the marriage between my daughter and Cade Rawlins these past weeks. I have seen how he cares for her, how she has flourished under his protection. This is no fraud or deception, this is love, pure and simple. The kind of love I should have shown my daughter, but was too proud to give." The simple gold wedding band on Lila's finger caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows as another contraction racked her body. She looked at her father through tears of pain and unexpected hope, seeing for the first time in months the man who had raised her rather than the cold stranger who had cast her out. "I ask this court," Isaiah concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, "to recognize what I was too blind to see, that my daughter has found not just a husband, but a true partner. That the child she carries will be raised by parents who chose each other freely and love each other deeply." Judge Carmichael looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the community members who had witnessed this unexpected testimony. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both legal authority and human compassion. "In light of the testimony presented and the immediate circumstances," he announced, "this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion in the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Rawlins. The union is declared valid in all respects, and Mr. Whitmore's petition is denied." Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice cutting through Thomas's protests, "this court warns Mr. Whitmore that any further harassment of the Rawlins family will result in legal consequences. Your parental claims, such as they were, ended when you abandoned your responsibilities." As if in celebration of the verdict, Lila's body announced that the baby would wait no longer. Her cry of pain mixed with relief echoed through the courthouse, and Cade didn't wait for further permission before carrying her toward the door. "Dr. Morrison," he called over his shoulder, "we'll need your help." "Right behind you," the doctor replied, gathering his medical bag with practiced efficiency. As they left the courthouse, Lila caught one last glimpse of Thomas's defeated face and her father's expression of profound regret mixed with hope for redemption. The legal battle was over, but the most important part of her journey was just beginning, the moment when she would finally hold her child in her arms, free from shame and surrounded by love. 6 hours later, as the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Elizabeth Sarah Rawlins took her first breath in the bedroom, where her mother had found refuge and love. She was perfect in every way that mattered: tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a voice that announced her arrival with indignant vigor. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered half the babies in cold mercy, declared her the healthiest infant he had seen in months. Cade held his daughter with the reverent care of a man who understood he was holding a miracle. His large, work-roughened hands looked impossibly gentle, cradling the tiny bundle, and when Elizabeth wrapped her miniature fingers around his thumb, Lila saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect." "She looks like you," Lila said, though she knew it was probably too early to make such determinations. What she really meant was that Elizabeth already showed signs of the quiet strength that defined the man who would raise her as his own daughter. The handmade cradle that had waited so patiently in the corner of their room finally served its purpose, lined with soft blankets that Mrs. Patterson had brought during the long afternoon of labor. Elizabeth settled into it, as if she had always belonged there, which, Lila reflected, she had. The days that followed blurred together in the sweet exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. Cade proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings without complaint and learning to change diapers with the same careful attention he brought to every task. He would stand by the cradle for long minutes just watching Elizabeth sleep, and Lila often caught him talking to her in low, gentle tones about the ranch, the animals, and the life she would grow up knowing. "She'll need to learn to ride before she can properly walk," he told Elizabeth one morning as he changed her diaper with practiced efficiency. "Can't live on a ranch without knowing horses. And we'll teach her about the garden too, how to make things grow, how to be patient with the seasons." Lila watched these interactions with a contentment so complete it sometimes took her breath away. This was what family looked like, not the cold duty she had known in her father's house, but the warm partnership she and Cade had built together. Elizabeth would grow up understanding that love was shown through daily kindnesses, through steadfast presence, through choosing to stay when staying was difficult. 3 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, her grandfather came calling. Reverend Isaiah Mercer arrived on a Sunday afternoon, his hands twisting his hat brim as he stood awkwardly on the front porch. He looked older than Lila remembered, as if the weight of his regrets had aged him more than mere time. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if I might meet my granddaughter." Lila and Cade exchanged glances, both remembering the cold stranger who had given her away like unwanted property. But they also remembered the broken man who had stood before the courthouse and confessed his failures to the entire community. "She's sleeping," Lila said, stepping aside to let him enter. "But you're welcome to see her." Isaiah followed them to the bedroom where Elizabeth lay in her cradle, one tiny fist pressed to her cheek in the complete abandon of infant slumber. For several minutes, he simply stood there, his eyes drinking in every detail of the granddaughter he had almost lost through his own pride. "She's perfect," he whispered finally, echoing Cade's words from that first night. "Absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold her?" Lila offered, and the hope that flickered in her father's eyes reminded her of the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her to fish in the creek behind the parsonage. Isaiah held Elizabeth with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being given an undeserved gift. When she stirred and opened her eyes, fixing him with that unfocused but intense gaze that newborns possessed, his composure finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he said, the words directed at Elizabeth but meant for them all. "I'm so sorry for everything, for failing your mother when she needed me most, for valuing my pride over my daughter's welfare, for almost missing the chance to know you." "We all make mistakes, Reverend," Cade said quietly. "What matters is what we do next." What Isaiah did next was surprising in its humility. He began visiting regularly, not as the righteous preacher dispensing judgment, but as a grandfather eager to be part of his granddaughter's life. He helped with the garden harvest, shared stories of Lila's mother that brought tears and laughter in equal measure, and gradually rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that his pride had nearly destroyed. Thomas Whitmore, meanwhile, had left Cold Mercy immediately after the court hearing and had not been heard from since. Attorney Brennan had returned to Denver, presumably to find clients with more promising cases. The town itself seemed to have collectively decided that the Rawlins family deserved the same respect accorded to any other established ranch family in the valley. On a crisp October morning, when Elizabeth was 2 months old and the aspen trees had turned the mountainsides to gold, Lila stood in her wildflower garden holding her daughter. The flowers had grown beyond her wildest expectations, creating a natural meadow that attracted butterflies and birds in delightful abundance. Elizabeth seemed fascinated by the dancing butterflies, her eyes tracking their movement with the intense concentration only babies could achieve. "Look there, little one," Lila whispered, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby stem. "Beautiful things can grow from the smallest beginnings." Cade emerged from the barn where he had been tending to a horse with a minor injury, and the sight of his 2 girls, surrounded by flowers, made him stop in his tracks. This was the family he had never dared hope, for the love that had grown from what others saw as punishment into something more precious than gold. "What are you thinking about?" Lila asked as he joined them in the garden. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Thinking about how sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." Elizabeth chose that moment to take her first tentative steps, wobbling between her parents with the determined concentration of someone tackling a great adventure. As she collapsed into Cade's waiting arms with a delighted giggle, Lila realized that this was what redemption looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of countless small choices to love, to stay, to build something beautiful together. The woman who had once been handed over as punishment had become the queen of her own small kingdom, ruling not through power, but through the quiet sovereignty of a life built on love, respect, and the knowledge that some gifts come disguised as burdens until we learn to see them clearly.